I wake up to the gentle rays of the morning sun, which slowly filter through the antique windows of my cozy home in the picturesque, historic town of New England. Every day begins with a quiet sense of tranquility and confidence, as if the entire world is synchronized with the rhythm of my heart. In our home, filled with warm memories and family traditions, I find both support and joy. My husband, Ethan, with whom I've shared many years, is always by my side. His calm voice and wise gaze remind me that true closeness lies in the little things of everyday life. Together, we cherish our morning teas in the small yet bright kitchen, evening walks along the streets where every stone holds a story, and quiet conversations during family dinners. A special spark of life is brought to our home by my daughter, Madison. Her tireless energy and lively curiosity about the world around her make every day a little brighter. As a student at the local college, she effortlessly combines her studies with dreams of the future, inspiring us with her optimism and thirst for knowledge. Her laughter, echoing through the corridors of our home, reminds me of how important sincerity and joy are in every moment. Every detail of my surroundings, from the cozy streets to the ancient buildings, seems to be created to evoke a sense of stability and beauty. The town where I live holds countless stories, and its atmosphere fills my soul with peace and hope for the future. In such moments, I feel how our life is made up of small yet priceless moments, giving a sense of perfect beginnings, where the future seems infinitely bright and full of possibilities. With each passing day, a feeling began to grow within me, as if an invisible emptiness was quietly creeping in and filling the corners where joy and inspiration once lived. Walks through the old streets of the town, which once connected me to the past and sparked new dreams, now left behind only a cold echo of lost interest with every repetition of the familiar route. The work of a freelance designer, which had once been a window into a world of creativity and self-expression, gradually turned into a routine of completing tasks devoid of the sincerity it once held. Even my favorite projects no longer ignited that genuine passion within me, and ideas, once ablaze with a bright light, now seemed like dim reflections of long-forgotten times. In my relationship with Ethan, I began to notice an invisible chasm forming between us. Our evenings, which once were filled with quiet conversations, laughter, and mutual understanding, now more often saw silence replace words, as if each of us was slowly taking something important within, something that once made us closer to one another. This feeling wasn't loud or harsh. It slowly built up, leaving behind a subtle but painful bitterness of loss. This almost imperceptible, quiet departure was the hardest trial for me. The realization that what once seemed eternal was slipping through my fingers, like water in a river's current. Every day began to feel like a repetition, in which I searched for traces of past emotions, but found only the reflection of warmth long gone. The inner emptiness that was slowly enveloping me made me realize it was time to seek answers to questions that had long been ignored. One of those days, when doubts and anxiety seemed like inseparable parts of my existence, I decided to take the first step toward change by seeking help at the local personal growth center. In a room bathed in soft light and filled with the faint scent of jasmine, I was greeted by Julian. His calm voice and attentive expression immediately instilled a sense of confidence. Here, surrounded by carefully chosen books and cozy details in the decor, I felt that I could open up and sort through my feelings. Our conversations were not easy. Every word, every question from Julian helped me look at my life from a new perspective. Instead of offering simple solutions, he encouraged me to reflect, to explore the roots of my emotions, and to find in them an opportunity for personal growth. With his help, I began unraveling the knot of inner contradictions, realizing that even in the darkest moments, the seed of renewal was quietly taking root. Each meeting became a step closer to myself. Through open discussions, I learned to embrace my weaknesses and find in them the strength for transformation. In this process of support, I finally felt that I was ready for change, even if the path ahead proved to be more challenging than I had anticipated. Over time, as I became more open during my meetings with Julian, a strange yet relieving feeling began to emerge. I could feel how his understanding and support, though always within the boundaries of professionalism, filled me with something I had been lacking: attention, care, the ability to be heard. And it was more than just therapy. In his eyes, I saw genuine interest and concern, something I had been missing in my everyday life. In our conversations, I could speak about the deepest emotions, the fears that had long been hidden from those around me. Each session became not just therapeutic, but almost a cleansing process where I could be honest with myself. I can't say I was blind to the fact that this connection was moving beyond the usual patient-consultant dynamic. I realized that I was finding comfort in his words and gaze, but I tried not to cross the line. At the same time, I felt how our bond was becoming an important part of my life, a reliable foundation I could lean on in moments of doubt. I made an effort to keep myself composed, to be honest both with myself and with him. I understood that any emotions that arose couldn't simply be experienced. They needed to be reflected upon and understood before moving forward. But still, this connection with Julian left a strange warmth in my heart, something I hadn't felt in a long time, and that couldn't help but stir me. One summer morning, I decided to meet Julian at a small cafe on the town's central square. We often held our sessions in his office, but this time he suggested a more relaxed atmosphere. Over a cup of coffee, surrounded by the sounds of lively street conversations, it would be easier to relax and break down my inner barriers, I agreed. Sitting at a table by the window, I felt the warmth of the cup's steam gradually calming my nerves. Julian spoke about the importance of accepting ourselves as we are, not striving for an idealized image. His words were simple and calm, but they reached straight to my heart. In that moment, it felt as though I was finding the answers to questions that had been troubling me for years. And then, suddenly, the cafe door opened and Madison walked in. My daughter. She immediately spotted us at the table and, not expecting to see me there, froze at the entrance. Her gaze pierced through me with such force that I felt everything inside me tighten. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said it all: disappointment, pain, and confusion. I tried to smile, but I couldn't even believe it myself. Madison stared at us for a long moment, then silently walked past, ignoring our attempts to catch her gaze. I noticed her shoulders tense, and just before she left, I heard the door close with a dull thud. My heart began to race. I knew that this wasn't just a coincidence. Thoughts immediately crossed my mind. She might have thought or felt something that couldn't be revealed in the span of a single meeting. I couldn't even figure out what scared me more: the encounter with my daughter or the coldness with which she had looked at me. Later, when I returned home, the events of the day were swirling in my mind, refusing to settle. Soon, Madison approached me, her face tense and her eyes filled with hidden pain. We were alone, and her words, spoken in a restrained but firm tone, instantly froze me in place. "If you don't buy me a new laptop for my studies, I'll tell Ethan everything I saw today," she said, barely holding back tears. Her voice was steady, but it carried not just anger, but also desperation, as if she herself didn't fully believe what she was saying. I felt her words cut through my heart like a knife. My mind seemed to freeze, and I couldn't immediately pull myself together. Thoughts rushed through my head. How could she do this? Why hadn't she come to me with questions instead of immediately resorting to threats? Madison had always been strong, independent, and now I was seeing her in a different light. Vulnerable, yet simultaneously ruthless. I hadn't expected such a turn of events. "You understand, don't you, that if I tell him, Ethan will be utterly devastated?" she continued, looking me straight in the eyes. I felt a cold sweat form on my brow. Everything I had built in my life, in my family, in my relationship with Ethan, seemed to be at risk of falling apart. But why had she chosen such a cruel manipulation? Why had I ended up in this tangled situation where all I could do was choose between the fear of the truth being revealed and giving her what she demanded? The days that followed that conversation with Madison became heavy and confusing for me. She kept me on edge like a shadow, and I could feel the situation consuming me entirely. I couldn't share this with Ethan. There would be too much pain in his eyes, I knew that. Yet the thought that he could find out was unbearable. But Ethan began to notice the changes. He saw that I had become more withdrawn, that our conversations had become rare and restrained. His questions grew more persistent, and I started to avoid them. I couldn't understand what exactly had caught his attention, what made him so perceptive, but his intuition had never failed him. Over time, his concern turned into something more tangible, and I realized he had decided to take action. He hired a private detective. I didn't know about this until I began to feel his gaze becoming more penetrating and his questions sharper. Ethan had never been the kind of person to delve into investigations or suspicions, but now, in his eyes, I could see the reflection of the worries that were growing inside him. Soon, I learned that the private investigation had uncovered not only my secret meetings with Julian, but also more unpleasant truths. Calvin, Madison's boyfriend, was connected to people I had never known, people whose dealings and reputations raised many questions. While Madison was aware of her relationship with Calvin, she didn't know all the details that were soon coming to light. When Ethan began talking more about what he felt and what he had discovered, it became clear to me that my attempts to hide the truth had not only failed, but had ultimately led to catastrophic consequences. Everything I had kept inside was now becoming obvious. The fear of how he would react was nothing compared to what I had already lost. Our relationship began to collapse rapidly, and I could feel him pulling away from me. Every conversation, every confrontation became more painful. I became increasingly convinced that the trust that had once been the foundation of our life was crumbling, like a sandcastle unable to withstand the first strong wind. But what hurt the most was the feeling that I had trapped myself in this situation. The day came when Ethan, having gathered all the evidence, could no longer hold back and decided to lay everything out. It was an evening when we gathered as a family at our favorite restaurant. We always chose this place for family dinners, and I thought tonight would be just as quiet and peaceful as all the previous ones. But when Ethan began to speak, everything changed. We were sitting at the table, and I felt as though the air in the room had grown heavy, saturated with tension. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that I couldn't help but notice. He carefully placed documents in front of him. Reports from the detective, photographs, notes he had made to prove his suspicions. I felt an icy fear tighten around me. "I know about your meetings with Julian," he said, not looking away. I couldn't believe my ears, yet I knew he couldn't be wrong. It was the moment when the world, which had once seemed stable, suddenly began to shake. He continued, "I know about Calvin, about his friends, and I understand you're hiding something." Every word he spoke felt like a blow from the inside out. He spoke calmly, but his words were filled with disappointment and pain. Madison sat next to us. Her gaze was frightened, but also full of fear and anger. She couldn't understand what was happening and probably didn't realize that her world was crumbling right then and there. She remained silent at first, but then suddenly stood up, demanding an explanation, her voice trembling with emotion. This was a test for all of us, and I realized that everything I had built had been destroyed in a single moment. I couldn't take my eyes off Ethan's face. In his eyes, I saw not just pain, but exhaustion. He was just like me. Not perfect, but willing to fight for our family. He didn't know how to handle the fact that I had betrayed his trust. I couldn't justify myself, because I knew that everything he said was true. Then there was a long, silent pause. Time seemed to freeze, and I felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on my shoulders. I tried to find words to explain myself, but nothing came. What could justify my actions? No matter what reasons I could come up with, they wouldn't bring back what had been lost. Madison, unable to bear it, jumped up and ran out of the restaurant, not saying a word. I could feel all her faith in me draining away. Ethan sat still, his hands folded on the table, and I knew his decision had already been made. We had all lost something important, and now we had to face the consequences. I sat in complete silence, torn by inner conflict. What should we do next? How could we go on living? These questions spun in my head, but there were no answers. All I knew was that there was no turning back on this path. The moment Ethan asked Madison and me to leave the house, I felt everything I had once considered my sanctuary crumble away. The home where we had experienced the most important moments of our lives, where so many memories were made, had now become a stranger. I stood in the empty hallway, looking at Ethan, who was as broken as I was, but his eyes held no anger, no resentment, only exhaustion and disappointment. Madison had already left without saying a word, and I couldn't understand what had driven her to act that way. She wasn't just my daughter. She was part of what Ethan and I had built together. But now everything was destroyed. She didn't believe in me, and I didn't believe in myself anymore. Summoning what little strength I had left, I began to gather my things, not knowing what the future would hold. The suitcases felt heavy, as if each item was reminding me of everything I was losing. I walked through the house, trying to remember every detail, every thread that connected me to this place. Here were my traces, my scent, my dreams. All of it was fading as I took the last of my things. That night, I left, leaving behind everything I had once valued. The place that had once been my home was now empty. I didn't know where I would be tomorrow. I didn't know how I would endure the loss. All the bonds I had thought were unbreakable had fallen apart in an instant. I was in a strange city, in a foreign world, and despite my feelings and emotions, I knew I had to move forward. But how? The next morning, when I woke up in a hotel, I realized that I would now have to face being alone. Alone with myself, with what I had done, with what I had lost. I didn't know how to begin anew, how to rebuild my life from scratch. Yet I knew that this was the only way forward. With every passing minute, with every step in this new world, I was learning to see myself differently. No excuses could restore the lost trust. Ethan was right. I had lost him. I had lost everything. But now I had to find the strength to learn how to live again. Not for anyone else, but for myself. In the solitude I felt immediately after leaving the house, I began searching for answers. There were no familiar faces around, no familiar routines, no sense of security. Everything around me became new and foreign, and I was forced to face myself head-on. Those emptinesses I had once tried to ignore now pressed on me with an incredible force. I turned to a therapist. The decision was difficult, as I had long tried to cope with myself without anyone's help. But now I understood that I needed to understand what had happened and why I had found myself in this situation. Why had I allowed myself to go so far? Why had I let myself destroy what once seemed unbreakable? My meetings with the therapist became regular. We began to unpack my past, my actions, and how I had perceived my life. I tried to understand what inside me had led to such a desperate emptiness that I sought support where I shouldn't have. I became aware of my mistakes, one by one, and felt how hard it was to walk this path. Every day I asked myself questions that had no easy answers. Where had I gone off course? Why had my feelings and needs become more important than everything else? And why had I allowed myself to be manipulated in moments of weakness? It was not just punishment for my actions, but also a chance to become better, to understand myself, and perhaps to forgive myself. As I began to examine these questions, I realized that a path to redemption was unfolding before me, but it was long and fraught with difficulty. I could no longer look for easy ways or excuses. I had to go through this pain and see other people differently, with understanding, with respect. I began to build a new life. My new home was a small but cozy apartment in another part of the city, which I moved into with a sense of loneliness, but also with hope. I spent a lot of time in silence, in reflection, and although it was hard, I felt that this was my path. I was learning to live without attachment to things, to people, to old expectations. I was learning to love myself again, despite everything that had happened. Ethan and Madison were trying to rebuild their relationship. I observed this from afar, knowing that I couldn't intervene. This was their time, their process. And although it hurt, I understood that each of us had to walk our own path to healing. I couldn't go back, but perhaps our lives could evolve in different directions. and the experience we all went through could serve as the foundation for a better future. Months had passed since I left the house and began my new life. The time I spent in solitude was not easy, but it was necessary. It was time to grieve the loss, to acknowledge my mistakes, and to begin changing myself. I learned to appreciate silence again, to be at peace with myself. But one day, when it seemed as if my days had sunk into the monotony of routine, I felt as though life had finally decided to give me something. One day, as I walked through the streets of the city, along the very narrow alleys that once brought me a sense of tranquility, I saw him. Julian. He was standing outside the cafe where we had met a few months ago. He didn't notice me at first, and I thought I would just walk by. But something inside me stopped me. I didn't expect the encounter with him to be so meaningful. We exchanged glances, and he spoke first. "How are you?" he asked, as if this meeting were not accidental but long awaited. His voice, still calm, sounded familiar and comforting. We walked together into that very cafe, the place where so much had changed. In his eyes, I noticed something new, understanding and respect, but nothing more. We talked for a long time. He spoke of his own journey, how he had also learned to let go of people and experiences. He said that my steps were important, that they had led me to where I was now. But what mattered wasn't what he said. What mattered was that we sat together in silence, without expectations or demands. That conversation became a symbol for me that life doesn't end with mistakes. At some point, I realized that our paths had crossed not by chance. Julian, like me, had learned to let go, to appreciate the present. He wasn't the same person he had once been, and neither was I. We were both different people, but that didn't stop us from finding something important in each other. Since then, we started meeting more often, not to search for answers or excuses, but simply to be. To be in the present, not wasting ourselves on regrets or building imaginary futures. Perhaps our lives would never be the same as before, but now I believe that the most important thing is the ability to start again, even when everything seems lost. After all, every ending is just the beginning of something new, something I hadn't yet imagined. Several more months passed, and I finally felt the light begin to return to my life. It wasn't as bright and blinding as it had been in my youth, but it was steady and calming, like the morning sun gently peeking through the curtains. In my new apartment, I began to feel more and more comfortable. Every corner, every item I surrounded myself with was the result of my own efforts, my steps toward healing. I began to pay more attention to my work. I had clients, new projects, and although none of them were as significant as before, I started to appreciate the process itself. I had rediscovered my love for creativity, but now every design wasn't just a job. It was part of me, a piece of my journey. It was no longer an obligation. It was an expression of who I had become. Madison reached out from time to time. She too was on her own path, and I felt that she, just like me, was growing. We began to speak more openly, without hidden resentments or unspoken words. I still couldn't fully regain her trust, but I started to sense that her heart was slowly opening again. We were finding new ways to be there for each other, understanding that our connection would never be the same, but that didn't mean it couldn't still be important. Ethan, too, continued his journey. Though our relationship had definitively ended, I felt he was finding himself as well. He and Madison seemed closer than ever, and I was genuinely happy for them. Sometimes, even from a distance, I felt that our lives were still intertwined, and each of us was finding a way to move forward, despite the loss. But I continued my path, just like everyone else. There were no illusions, no clear plans for the future. I had learned not to fear that uncertain space between the past and the future, that place where I could just be myself, without looking back at past mistakes and without fear of what lay ahead. That day, like all the others, began calmly. I was sitting at the table, working on yet another project, when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but without hesitation, I picked up the receiver. It felt strange, but at some point, I realized I was looking for surprises. I had long stopped fearing change. On the other end of the line was Ethan. His voice, one I could have recognized among thousands before, sounded quiet but steady. "Olivia, we need to talk," he said. I froze. My heart skipped several beats. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation. We agreed to meet at the same restaurant where everything had once begun, the place that was now tied to pain and loss for both of us. I arrived first, and as I sat at the table, a strange unease began to settle in. Everything I had been through during this time felt distant, as if I were a completely different person. But something inside me told me that this meeting would be decisive. When Ethan walked into the restaurant, his face was calm, but his eyes betrayed that he hadn't come just to talk. He sat down across from me, and the first thing he said was unexpected. "I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges against you." His words hung in the air, and I froze. It felt so foreign to everything that had transpired between us. But at the same time, it was the first step I could understand. Ethan had always been the kind of man who placed family first, and his words seemed to tell me that he wasn't just trying to rebuild our relationship. He was trying to return to the life we had lost. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was filled with thousands of thoughts, and each one seemed to shatter the world I had been trying to rebuild. We had both been through so much. I couldn't just turn things back. I didn't want to. But he continued. "I needed to realize a lot, Olivia, and I've understood that we need to find a way to move forward, each in our own way, but maybe not as alone as before." I fell silent again, processing his words. We were both searching, each in our own way. Ethan didn't expect me to come back, and I didn't know if I could. But in this new understanding, I felt not fear, but some kind of liberation. We had stopped being that ideal family we once dreamed of. But in this new world, there were still chances. Our meeting wasn't a reconciliation. There was no return. But it became something far more important. It was the moment when we both acknowledged that we couldn't turn time back, but we could build our future based on what we had lived through. And in that, perhaps there was a new chance. Not for us as a couple, but for each of us to find harmony within ourselves. Several weeks had passed since that meeting with Ethan, and I seemed to have regained my peace. We continued moving in different directions, but without resentment, without the constant guilt that had once consumed me. I began to rebuild my life, and despite the loneliness, I felt that I was once again in control of my fate. But one day, after a typical workday, as I was about to head home, I received an unexpected call. It was Julian. His voice was tense, and I could feel that something had happened. "Olivia, we need to talk. Urgently," he said, and there was an anxiety in his voice that I had never heard before. We met a couple of hours later in the same cafe where our conversation had begun several months ago. He was sitting at the table, nervously sorting through papers as though searching for something. When I sat down, he looked at me and said words that instantly changed everything. "I can't stay silent anymore, Olivia. You need to know this. Everything you've been through, it wasn't a coincidence. And I can't hide the truth from you." He paused, and I felt his words crash down on me like a heavy burden. I tried to understand what he was saying, but I couldn't grasp the meaning. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Julian exhaled and continued. "All this time, I've been holding something important back. The meetings with you, our conversations, and everything we went through. It was all part of something bigger. I couldn't tell you before, but now I must. Madison, she knew I was meeting with you. She didn't just walk into that cafe by chance. She made me hide everything that was happening between us. She manipulated both you and me. I didn't want to involve you, but now I can't stay silent." My heart stopped. Everything I thought I knew suddenly came into question. Madison, my daughter, had manipulated me? I couldn't believe it. With every word Julian spoke, my perception of everything that had happened began to shift. I felt like the ground was slipping away beneath me. "I didn't want this, Olivia. I didn't want you to be dragged into this. Madison, she has her own reasons, And she didn't just use you to get what she wanted. At that moment, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of utter loss. I didn't know how to process these words. All the connections, all the relationships, everything I had built and believed to be true, now seemed in question. What do I do? I whispered, looking at him. Julian looked at me with sympathy. You need to figure this out, Olivia. On your own. I can't decide for you what happens next, but you need to know the truth. I walked out of the cafe, and everything around me seemed to begin crumbling. Madison, my daughter, the one I had trusted more than anyone in the world, had been involved in some hidden games I had no idea about. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to find out what had happened. And now, I couldn't keep turning a blind eye to the truth that had been kept from me.